Hi. I'm going to argue that there's a deeper meaning in many of the MCU films there's a lot to unpack in these movies. We can engage the pseudoscience in its own way, we can delve into theories about hidden or unexplained details and speculate about future events. But a lot of people just dismiss the MCU as pure entertainment. They argue that the MCU films are just crude action movies that they rip out story content and character details from an existing comics continuity and they staple it together in a passable way, but they all follow the same formula, or it's just simply the hero's journey, so not much more there. I agree there's a formula to a lot of the movies. I agree that the hero's journey definitely applies, but there's a lot more than that going on. I mean, almost all superhero films are going to fit those descriptors. Yet, if we place them side by side with the MCU, I don't think it's just nebulous or unexplainable why the MCU films are more popular. I mean, when you reduce a story down to a formula, that analysis can only be proper if you also analyze then how it deviates from that formula. It's great to make the statement, I want more. I'm making this video because it seems like a lot of the conversations just end there. We are allowed to criticize or laud aspects of Iron Man versus Man of Steel, but they're both superhero stories, but they both follow the hero's journey. So the difference between them, it's just a matter of writing and polish. Is that all there is? I mean, I don't think so. I think that there's another concrete layer that we can analyze to explain partially why the MCU films resonate so well with audience. It's the writing and polish are definitely factors, but I mean, the MCU is filled with characters, their powers, their personalities, and when I watch an MCU film, I see another layer that rises out from the screen. It's while watching these movies, the characters become symbolic. They become contemporary. They become commentary on the virtues they represent. They elevate themselves beyond just superheroes punching supervillains, and they make themselves metaphorically relevant to casual life. Indeed, that's the core of the hero's journey, but within the MCU, I believe they've made each character distinct, and by having a unique symbolic value, the stories maintain themselves in being just more diverse. There's definitely some retreaded ground, but the generation of new conflicts, the presentation of characters, the perspectives that they share, it's always going to remain clear and consistent to both the writer and the audience. Symbolic analysis is tricky. It's often syllogistic. You know, anyone can present new evidence, make a new claim that there's an argument, it's symbolic of this, etc. And most of those claims are not mutually exclusive. So how do you ever get anywhere? Here, I'm going to do my best to present a concrete list of symbolic traits or heroic virtues that I believe the main MCU characters represent. I'm going to argue that I think by my analysis, these are the best representative symbols for these characters. There's many layers that we can analyze in these movies, but I'm trying to focus on if we represent, each character down to their simplest component, what's left as a description of the character. So I'm going to outline just sort of what I'll talk about and any possible value you might have in it. And if none of this interests you, please turn away. You spend your time on something more valuable. I'm going to explore a symbolic analysis of action movie narratives, which sort of feels intuitively laughable, but a lot of people just wave it off like we don't need to put effort into that sort of analysis. It's super simple. Or look, hero's journey, I've analyzed it, move on. I think there's a lot more going on, and to me, I find value in that sort of analysis, at very least, for helping to generate new stories. Part of what I'll talk about a lot is components of the hero and villain patterns that show up in these movies, which may be useful for narrative writing. I've found it useful in tabletop gaming. A lot of this comes from work I've just tried to systematize narratives as much as possible beyond devices and tropes and story components, but looking at examples where repeated patterns emerge and what's successful or unsuccessful about those patterns. In general, I find that very useful in tabletop gaming. In general, I'm going to argue that there is a deeper meaning going on in these films. Yes, there is, I think, a formula to a lot of them, but it's what you fill the formula with that really matters and gives it value beyond just, hey, we've followed a script. I like a lot of movies, a lot of different types of movies, and they differ a lot in terms of complexity, different layering. I really think there is an unappreciated complexity within the MCU. I think audiences intuitively appreciate this. I don't, but I don't see it well articulated in reviews or criticisms of these films. So I just wanted to contribute my perspective on that. I've been into mythology since I was really young, and I'm not the first person that says like Marvel is a modern mythology. Uh, and this is exactly what I want to dig into. I mean, if these stories are a mythology, then they should be able to find some symbolic value in it that draws people in, and I think that's definitely the case here. And I think it's definitely the case that people tend to just dismiss it and say it's not more than just what it looks like. Um, or at least, I mean, I've had conversations where I go in making a statement like, oh, I found a formula that I think is more concrete to the MCU origin story, and hoping to discuss what about it works, what about it is interesting, and then just be met with, oh, well, duh, it's Joseph Campbell, it's the hero's journey, we all know that. Yeah, I'm aware of the hero's journey. I am bringing up an MCU origin story as a deviation from that because I think there's a concrete deviation from that that's shared, and I find specific commonalities in the MCU movies and how they're structured. And to say that there's symbolic value, and say there's symbolic value here, I'm going to argue that these symbols are based as much as possible on structural content, what's actually in the movies, at least when contrasted against each other, because that's a big thing that's going to come up a lot, is that they're not necessarily unique unless you consider them against each other, at least in terms of that they repeat certain heroic actions because they are heroes. So to argue that they're unique, or more accurately, that these are their defining or emphasized symbolic traits. As much as possible, I'm going to try and avoid interpretation or just try to argue from what is explicitly presented within the films. So, whoa, so here I want to present sort of analysis of the one layer of the symbols going on in the MCU that spans across what I call the origin stories, or the origin story formula movies. I recognize many of the MCU movies follow what I call an origin story formula. I would consider those to be Iron Man 1, The Incredible Hulk. Iron Man 2, I think, fits it, although I'm not really going to talk about that much today. Captain America, the First Avenger, Thor 1, Guardians of the Galaxy 1, Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man Homecoming, Black Panther, and I'm going to bet that Captain Marvel as well will follow this origin story formula. As of making this video, that makes there currently 9 examples. I think Iron Man 2 mostly follows this formula, though it doesn't really introduce new content for the hero. I think it does for the villains, but I've included it since it fits the pattern. I'm not really going to discuss it. Similarly, Guardians of the Galaxy is very different. We can focus on Star-Lord as a central hero and see how the pattern analysis holds up, or it doesn't. It doesn't fit perfectly, in part because Guardians of the Galaxy is an ensemble movie, and I'll explore how the entire team organizes around a central symbol in some way, except Groot. But starting from the conclusion of my analysis, I see each of the heroes as being individually symbolic of some aspect of heroism, more so than the other characters as some defining trait or heroic virtue. The characters are not just the symbolic representations of these, but their individual narratives, particularly the origin stories, are centered around exploration of these symbols and ideas. For simplicity, I'm arguing with symbols, I've tried to reduce it down to single one-word description that I think best represents or summarizes characters. A lot of that, if you're watching this, you're going to disagree with, and I'd love to hear feedback commentary because I just want to keep getting this better and better. Some of them, I think some of them are straightforward, and I think that even without hearing me walk through it, a lot of people would agree. Others are very difficult to reduce down into a single word, and that's just how it is. But presenting sort of this, my statement, what I think the heroes of the MCU are symbolic of: Iron Man, the hero of creativity, aspects of invention, intellect. Bruce Banner, the Hulk, is hero of responsibility or temperance. Thor is the hero of duty. Captain America, the hero of sacrifice. Star-Lord, I'm going to argue, is the hero for inspiration. Honestly, it's easiest to find to me as like anti-apathy, but defining it by its opposite is messy. And there's also the component of it that's family, but we'll get there. Ant-Man, I'm going to call morality or moral judgment. He's the hero of morality, or the hero of justice, might be another way to put it. Doctor Strange is intellect. I think that's very strongly fitting, although the component of intellect that's more wisdom understanding is a lot of what falls through when I get to that analysis. Spider-Man is the hero of diligence, Black Panther, the hero of independence or self-reliance. By independence, I mean like independent thought. Um, so, to make my case, I'm going to just establish some basic concepts of a mythological hero, argue why the superhero genre fits this pretty perfectly and it's not random, outline a pattern or skeleton for the origin stories. The components of the skeleton are all organized in some way around a central theme, that central symbol that's specific to that hero. The pattern's modular. You can start from the components or fragments of a story and then use it to generate a story, which is why it's formula. And once I've outlined the pattern, then I'm going to just which is most of this video, I'm just going to exhaustively go through the movies and show how they match the patterns or they defy it. I'm not trying to say, here's some pattern, it fits perfectly, look at la-di-da. There are definitely deviations, there's definitely misalignments. So my intent here is just to share my observations. I think about this stuff a lot. I like patterns and models, and to me, the variation of each story that may make it break the formula is interesting, while the underlying story is also useful for generating new things. I've incorporated this into some of my designing tabletop RPG adventures. It's a hobby, not personal use, not professional. But I wanted to share this analysis and hopefully work on refining these ideas with some feedback, see what people agree with, see what people disagree with. So what is a hero? The MCU movies follow Joseph Campbell's monomyth pretty closely, and it's a very very generic pattern. So I'm not going to argue that these movies fit that. I'd say it's obvious that you can just take it, but if you want to take it as an assumption, take it as an assumption for everything I'm going to do downstream of this. With regards to symbols, it's easy to say a character is symbolic or has some trait that makes the story a metaphor. In myths, it really varies. A deity is like, if it, usually has some symbolic association, and it's the pure or absolute or naturally perfect aspect of that concept or symbol. Spirits are usually some specific aspect of a symbol, spirit of rage, spirit of death, spirit of revenge. Monsters tend to be symbolic of destructive things, negative things, things that need to be confronted or fought. And then we can take this all the way out there from a writing standpoint, and then you occasionally encounter this thing, I believe some people refer to it, or at least in my head I call it, as character as metaphor. Just when you see a character and you're like, I can see the device, I can see the writing just working right there. That character exists to be a foil, and if done improperly, part of the reason it can sometimes be identified is because then you're like, it's a wooden character, it's a bland character, that character is just there for its symbolic contrast. And in between, right in the middle, what do we have left? We have the hero. The hero must face challenges and learn something. The only thing that's left is a person that matters. And the purpose of showing a hero story is that hopefully in some way there's something there we can empathize with and understand and maybe learn something or learn about a perspective through that hero. In a greater meta-narrative like the MCU, it's not good enough to just be heroic or to confront things or fight things, but you're going to need something distinct, something that makes the hero stand out from all the others. As a kid, I thought of this pretty crudely, like when thinking about superheroes, a group of heroes working together, where each one just wants to beat up the enemy. That's a race. Yeah, from a writing standpoint, you could back derive a challenge once you've established their powers, figure out how to combine them like a bunch of keys, and then you have a team. But unless those powers or the conflicts are symbolic in any way, it's going to be superficial and pretty lacking. I think the MCU writers are well aware of this and have been aware of this since the very beginning, that they knew they were going to have a large and diverse roster of heroes, so they needed them to each be unique in some way. They can give them flaws and gaps and limitations to their powers, but if they centralize the characters around a central symbolic core, thematic core, then each one, when they get together as a group, the roles are obvious. The perspectives in a conversation are intuitive to those personalities, to those symbols. And Marvel definitely plays that game of sort of puzzling out, how the superpowers work or how they manifest. But watching it play out, they fit together in creating a story. My point is that I'm going to argue that the MCU heroes have a central quality or trait that's heroic. this trait exists oftentimes independent of their superhero powers. Importantly, it's often what leads to them having powers in the first place, and they need to use this trait to refine the powers to control them and use them properly. In that way, that helps makes the physical confrontations represented in the story meaningful to us, the audience. It makes a fight against a villain have a clear symbolic value, contrasting aspects of an idea or clashing ideas against each other intuitively. Because the physical powers we're watching play out in the fight are manifestations derived from an inner quality that is it's inherently a commentary on that idea or on that symbol. Here I say hero to refer to a protagonist with unique heroic traits and some heroic powers that connect in a meaningful way. At least most of them connect in a meaningful way. But going back to it again, why superhuman? Why couldn't we do this with any sort of action genre? I think we could. But in modern life, as in ancient times, we live in this civilization. So that often means our challenges are more intellectual or social rather than just physical. The challenges in these stories are often explicitly physical, but jumping around. Sorry. Not just physical, but while physical threats still exist, in many of our daily lives, we don't confront beasts or monsters. In mythology, these run rampant. In the MCU stories, we've got superpowered villains, aliens, beasts. They serve the same role. It isn't a coincidence that the superhero genre is where characters can really easily be analyzed in terms of mythological symbolism. Converting conflicts into tricks of wit and supernatural physical fights, it's a convenient writing device to make metaphors. I mean, the challenges in these stories may be explicitly physical, but when the physical traits of the characters involved are symbolically connected to their inner traits, we obtain a convenient metaphor for a challenge. Just an example, right? So Iron Man analyzes situations and creates tools to help in fighting the enemy. The enemy may simply be some form of a physical threat, but it gives us an example. It's an example of a hero embodying creativity to save the day, to overcome a challenge. Our daily challenges are going to be very different from Iron Man's, but still require us to bolster ourselves and struggle through the application of our creativity. We can learn about the importance of evaluating our limits, the necessity of accepting outside help, the persistence required if we think we found something that's impossible. Many of the traits that I've listed here are generic to the concept of a hero. They're not exclusive. In particular, heroes need courage, perseverance, moral codes to be heroes at all. And so when I suggest something like Iron Man is the hero of creativity, it doesn't mean Captain America doesn't solve problems by being creative. Similarly, if Captain America represents the hero of sacrifice, doesn't mean Iron Man never has heroic sacrifice. It's just that the heroes have these as defining qualities, and they often represent the unique personal perspectives they contribute to the team. Or at very least, as I walk through the films, I'm going to argue that the origin story formula, as it's applied to these stories, really repeatedly bears out a sort of central organization around these concepts, or these specific heroic symbols. So, and just to be clear and to say again, this is going to be very spoiler heavy. I'm going to be walking through all the MCU movies that fit that origin story formula. So if you haven't seen them, you might be lost. I'm not going to try and make up for that ground. I'm going to assume you're watching this because you're interested in the idea of there being symbols there. If you're interested in the explicit stories, you should watch the stories first. That's just intuitive. But yeah, I'm not going to go through and establish clearly this character is the hero, this character is the villain, this order of events happen. I'm just going to talk about it. So from a writing perspective, when you have a set of... Oh, I already did that, sorry. Sorry, a script. Quick comment about the MCU villains. The MCU villains get criticized a lot as being weak villains. A lot of them do have abbreviated or incomplete personalities. We just tend to know a lot less about them than the other characters. I'll argue here most of these villains carry obvious symbolic value at contrasting with against the heroes. Indeed, I've heard a lot of comments of that some people say, right, that like a hero is truly defined by the villains that they oppose, by the villains they defeat. Amusingly, this is extremely true in ancient mythological heroes, and I think the MCU effectively inverts this and becomes hero-centric. In many ancient myths, the heroes are kind of generic and interchangeable. They often carry very little symbolic value unique to themselves. I mean, Gilgamesh and Hercules. Well, I mean, Hercules in a bit. I mean, like Hercules, Achilles. A lot of them, it's just like generic, strong, physical hero beats the opposition. When you put them all next to each other, you can find different things that they stand out as. But a lot of times within their own stories, they just function to fight the villain, fight the monster. That's the story. And so, in that sense, yeah, their symbolic value is oftentimes derived from contrast. It's what they represent that they're fighting that makes them meaningful. There's, yeah, the monsters they oppose, they're often dripping with symbolic value, like the chimeras, the chaos, unpredictability of the natural world, the Medusa, fear of death, and for a young male hero, the ultimate fear of death is the gaze of a woman that freezes him into inaction. I mean, the Lernaean Hydra, some terrifying persistence. You can't just fight it with force. You need to use some intelligence. I think that in the MCU, they use the villains as symbols first and fully develop characters second. I think that's just sort of an intentional quirk of the writing that led to the MCU stories. In the comics, the villains can stand alone. They can be fully developed. They can be on the same level as the hero in terms of detail. In many ways, the MCU is always going to be a compression of that content from the comics. So, I mean, the hero has to confront multiple villains across a film series. How much time are we going to devote to a single villain? Yes, sometimes that really leaves the villain characters, as a character, as metaphor. That just happens. To me, it's a forgivable consequence of the writing, or at least a lot of times I can engage with the symbolic contrast while I'm watching the film, and so the fact that the character isn't a great simulacrum of a human because they're not well developed as a personality, I oftentimes can at least look past most of the time. Sometimes it's really bad. Well, but yeah, I'm not saying this to negate the criticism. I mean, obviously, if the criticism is they're complete or underdeveloped characters, I'm agreeing with that in most cases. I'm just providing one possible explanation of why that writing choice may have been made and may have been at least conscious. They may have been aware this was a problem when they made the story, but why they chose to make sure that the focus was on making sure that symbolic value was intact rather than going for fully developed characters. And one thing I do find interesting about the MCU origin stories is that the villains are almost always, they serve as contrast to the hero or heroic traits. In classical mythology, symbolic threat of the monsters in villains is often rich and intense, and it's the heroes defined in opposition to that. So true is this true in MCU Avengers movies. The Avengers villains are often like that, but in the origin stories, the villains usually, at least by my analysis, they usually represent pernicious or dangerous threats, versions of what those characters could become if they become corrupted or they fall to their temptations. The villains is opposite of heroes' power, and as I'm going to walk through, a lot of times this manifests because there are villains which have supernatural or superhuman power without having the heroic trait that the hero does that refines that and puts that into control for the greater good, or they have a corrupted version of that trait. They are very much like the hero but use it for nefarious ends or focus on one aspect of it that brings them power rather than trying to use it for the good of others. So, what do I mean by MCU Origin Story? I'm just going to outline quickly what I mean by that, and then we're going to get right into it. In this video, I'm only focusing on the symbolic nature of the heroes across these movies. I'm not going to discuss the greater overall plot similarities, that is, what the full origin story formula is, as by my estimation. But I'm happy to outline that in greater detail in another video if people want, because I found it useful in some writing context. But as I walk through the films, I will contemplate on these components of the skeleton and whether each film and hero fits the pattern or does not. Most of these comments I've already referenced in some way, but just to formalize, the skeleton includes some heroic trait, some aspect of personality or skill that is symbolic core of the character. These often can be very difficult to clearly state in a few words. And they're much more complex than a single word in a lot of cases. But simplified, I can describe it as one symbol. At the start of each story, the heroic trait has they've allowed the protagonist for some great worldly attainment, status, wealth, power, success, or just something clearly the character desires or wants. but either due to this attainment or the power itself, or sometimes later when they develop the heroic power, I mean, the this character suffers in some way. Yeah, that can sometimes be a consequence of that power. But I'm viewing this skeleton as a conceptual starting point. There's going to be a lot of deviations across the films. I'm just presenting this unified framework to sort of better define how I arrived at my list of heroic heroic traits as symbols for the main heroes. Heroic power, it's fairly straightforward and obvious, but here, what I mean within the formula, it's going to be that the heroic trait leads in some way to the development or obtaining the heroic power. This is some superhero human power that the protagonist gains. It's usually central to the plot. It gives the character, greater agency to change and influence the world. There's a manifestation of it that is referring to the connection between the trait and the power when the character actually gets the power when it manifests. Then there's also a refinement component. Aside from manifestation, the heroic trait is also fundamental in properly wielding the power. This requires tempering, refining, using the power through active effort. Now, to the villains. I'm going to split this into what I'm going to call, surprisingly enough, pretty much all of these origin stories have two villains, and I'm going to say, generally speaking, they fall into two roles: the rival and the mastermind. Rival is some rival of the protagonist. It's a villain who covets and usually attains a power similar to the heroic power, hero, but they're usually a character that it lacks or is uninterested in the heroic trait. Without it, they can't properly wield the power. They're therefore dangerous or corrupted because they're not constrained in the same way that the heroes are. The mastermind, as I'll call it, is a villain who has a trait similar to the protagonist and also some notable worldly attainment. They often covet and then eventually also usually manifest a power similar to the protagonist, but they have some corrupted version of that trait and therefore wield the power improperly. Once I start walking through it, I think I'm going to make an argument for this case across the individual instances of the films, but that's part of why when people have made the comment that a lot of the MCU movies feature villains that seem just like a mirror reflection in terms of powers, in terms of a lot of personality traits to the heroes. That's intentional. That's because it's what are they centralized around? I'm arguing that that's what the writers want. They're presenting the story because they're saying, well, what is it that's different between Raza of the Ten Rings, Obadiah Stane, and Tony Stark as they centralize around creativity and technology? What's the comment there? What's being said? So it may seem trivial or esoteric to bring up so many components to this pattern, or easy to justify it by just forcing all the pieces into place. That's certainly a criticism of this type of analysis. I agree with it. I'm just presenting it. My intent is, and part of the reason I do it this way is I'm interested in being both descriptive and prescriptive. I'm interested in the core thematic symbols of these characters, and I do hypothesize that all the ones listed these components connect to that heroic trait all in some way. And I'm saying it's prescriptive because you can apply this to other start from other symbols, use this formula, and use it to write new stories. The distinction that I've mentioned here, rival and mastermind, has a lot of flexibility, and generally in these stories, there's more to it than just the symbolic aspects that define these roles. But notably, despite me calling the role mastermind, they're not always intelligent or scheming. Likewise, the rival isn't necessarily a rival beyond the overlap of similar powers when they actually come into conflict. As I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of exceptions across these 9 films, so I'm throwing out this pattern. This is how I derived my analysis, but it's not like it's 100% correct. So, time to walk through the movies. I'm going to be doing this in my own order. This is somewhat connects to how I like to view these movies or think about these movies in terms of creating a greater narrative, which I can outline in another video. Where I'm going to go Iron Man, Incredible Hulk, Thor, I should update this list. I'm actually going to do Captain America 1, Thor 1, Ant-Man, Black Panther, Spider-Man Homecoming, Doctor Strange, and Guardians of the Galaxy I'm going to save for the end just because it's more complex. It probably fits the skeleton most poorly. I'm really not happy with inspiration as it listed for the symbol word I've chosen. And just almost everything I'm going to argue with Guardians of the Galaxy, it's like You can take a stretch and it works, or you could not agree with the stretch and none of it works. So, what are we going to do? So, Iron Man, heroic trait, creativity, invention. You could also say intelligence, intellect. I think that generalizes a little beyond the scope of what Iron Man represents. Worldly attainment. He uses his creativity to create weapons and sells the weapons to become rich. Suffering. Well, he's focused only on himself. He's fulfilled constantly in applying his creativity, but he never focused that to solve himself or solve his life. The metaphor they use throughout the movie is that he has no heart, or that, he doesn't understand himself or exist outside of his work. Heroic power, the arc reactor, the Iron Man suits, very direct, as well as the manifestations, very direct. Tony creates the suits. He literally builds the technology. He builds himself up. Refinement, he tinkers and adjusts the suits, adjusts the properties of the technology. The altitude challenge that happens in the movie, it's actually very important for this symbolic to function on the symbolic level. When the suit fails, rather than panicking into inaction, he knows exactly what to do. He's built the whole thing. Even without power, he knows how to, adjust the flaps, probably saves his life. And when he returns, what does he do? He learns from his mistake. He immediately switches metal composition to avoid this problem in the future. Then later in the film, in contrast, Stain, who doesn't consider, he doesn't consider any of this, and Tony's able to escape from him because of this gap in knowledge. Stain survives, so it's a little unclear how he survived. But I mean, to the audience, it's a victory, even if brief, that Stark has, stemming from the synergy between his creativity and the suit, which his opponent lacks. Rival. Raza, leader of the Ten Rings. I'm not sure that name actually shows up in the film. This one's pretty obvious. He wants technology without invention, without creativity. He wants the power it gives without actually having to be capable of building it. Yeah, and the mastermind, Obadiah Stane. Obadiah. I have no idea that's spelled right. I should know that. But anyway, worldly attainment, he's a successful businessman. He has creativity in business. He applies weapons for profit. He circumvents laws to even make more money. He creatively devises plans that keep Tony out of the company, though those challenges are overcome. And in terms of having a corrupted trait, I mean, yeah, he's creativity in business. He's not interested in wielding the power to help anyone. At least that's pretty clear from the movie. Just for profit itself. There's several, and I say this, there's several opportunities where Stain could have tried to reconcile with Tony, or help Tony change the company in a way that they both agree with, that probably would leave Stain in a greater position of power, or in a position better to steal Iron Man later. But instead, I mean, he purely views Tony out of fear. Tony, this force of creativity, he's going to figure out that he betrayed him. He's going to discover the assassination attempt, and so that's it. He doesn't think about these other possibilities. He just restricts his scope. And yeah, later he just tries to remove Stark as a threat by indirectly killing him and then trying to directly kill him. I'm not going to bother with Iron Man 2. I've said that already, but it doesn't introduce much new hero. Iron Man 1 fits this formula pretty well. Most of the other films are going to have one or more things that they deviate from, up until some of the more recent ones, which also fit it extremely well. The Incredible Hulk. I've called the heroic trait responsibility. I somewhat prefer temperance because that's kind of what it is. But I mean, the point is controlled action, always staying in conscious, active control of your actions. It's a lot of the temperance and accountability aspects of responsibility. I still think responsibility sums it up well. This is in gross contrast to the Hulk itself, who's wild, savage, childlike, even almost incapable of responsibility. And worldly attainment, I'm going to say it doesn't really fit. I mean, you could argue that he acquired the Hulk power. You could argue he's a respected scientist, but the connection between all of that and responsibility is not really there. It works by contrast to Ross if you consider that Ross constantly seeks this power, but doesn't demonstrate he would properly wield it, versus Banner obtains the power and doesn't want it, so it's kind of like the power comes to him because he's responsible. But I'm not going to stretch it that far. Suffering, though, yeah, he suffers. He's a fugitive for having attained this power, this status, this greatness, by whatever measure. I mean, he is suffering. Um, and the heroic power itself is the Hulk. It's a little different from some of them. I mean, actually, several of the origin stories deviate in that the character already has their power established at the start of the film. Hulk was the first one, the second movie they released, that has that trend. Um, but yeah, I mean, though a lot of the films, he has basically no control over it and doesn't really even by the end of Act One. Though, I mean, I would say this film is literally watching him sort of progress across the film as he tries to guide it and ends with sort of being able to do that. At least suggests he has enough control to make the Hulk not just a rabid beast. Manifestation doesn't really fit. Again, you can kind of suggest it's a responsibility that leads to him obtaining the power or having the power. There's no conscious choice. It only really makes sense when you contrast him with Ross, so I'm not going to count it. Refinement, though, yes, that's pretty much what the story is, as I've already stated. I mean, it's him struggling to control the power at least a little, as much as possible, using, responsibly allowing it to go out to try and guide the Hulk. Rival, Emil Blonsky, Abomination, power without responsibility. He wants physical power with no responsibility for doing any, how to use it. The movie takes a really interesting route. Obviously, Blonsky is a power monger. He just wants to be stronger. But the discussion between Blonsky and Ross, I think, is really interesting because it suggests that part of Blonsky's personality is that he's trying to actively absolve himself from any responsibility. He's remained a soldier. He says it's what he likes, but in many ways, it's being a soldier. It allows him to avoid ever taking responsibility. He's not promoted into a place where he's responsible for others or responsible for their actions. He just follows orders. That's just all he does, and that's all the character is. I think that's a pretty fitting representation of trying to have power without necessarily responsibility. It's not to say that that's what every soldier is. I'm just saying that this character embodies that concept of sort of denying that you need to take responsibility, because if you're part of a system, you can just give yourself over to it. Again, not all soldiers are like that. The next one we're going to talk about, Captain America, is not like that. But Mastermind, we've got General Ross. Yes, he is striving to control and understand the power of the Hulk, but only for military purposes. He doesn't appear to consider having access to that power and not using it. That's exactly what Banner does, exactly the responsibility that Banner demonstrates. So it is what it is. In terms of worldly attainment, I mean, he's a military general that's accomplished. And he's obviously a responsible person in the sense that he has a high rank. He's responsible for other people. Other people look up to him. He's within a hierarchy where he has power, and he probably, a lot of that does have to do with some of his aptitudes. But in terms of a corrupted trait, it's his responsibility in many ways. Like Blonsky, he seemingly rejects individual responsibility. Ross wields his ability to be accountable or be responsible for the missions of the government, but he still ultimately defers those orders. That's what he's doing. I mean, he doesn't take full individual responsibility. It's just, we need to research military technology, therefore we're at the Hulk. Not, maybe we shouldn't be making the Hulk, like Banner argues. But to Ross, it's not really much of a question. It's, somebody else said this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what I'm supposed to do, and not question it. Alternatively, you could actually just analyze Ross as corrupt outright. Someone abusing his authority, his responsibility to others that trust him for his own career and personal gain. By either route, Ross has some corrupted version of responsibility. He's either lacking of individual responsibility or abuses his own authority, therefore lacking responsibility to others. Captain America, the first Avenger. This one's notably different in a few ways. Steve Rogers is a hero in many ways. Since he's being analyzed as a member of an ensemble, I focused on his unique or exemplary heroic trait, and it was actually fairly obvious. His selflessness, his suffering at the beginning of the story, while many times his heroism in the plot seems to be something like leadership, it's really his willingness to sacrifice that makes him distinct. In many ways, that's where his leadership comes from. It's the loyalty he commands. It stems from everyone who follows him recognizes that He understands what sacrifice means. He understands what his allies are risking for him. He's willing to risk and sacrifice for them, and he's not going to flippantly, he's not going to misuse their willingness to sacrifice. He's going to respect that and, guide them properly. And there again, we have two explicit villains in this one, but I mean, I'm going to argue Red Skull dominates both roles. Zola's there, but he's just kind of explicitly there. Red Skull, I'd say, is both the mastermind and the rival. And even with regards to analysis of the symbol, it's that he's both unwilling to undergo personal sacrifice, so wanting power without sacrifice, but also understands on sort of a social level a higher scale willingness to sacrifice for what he views as the greater good. He's willing to sacrifice a whole lot of people and blow up a whole lot of stuff to do what he thinks is the right thing, even though he's crazy. Arguable, but I'd say he is. Arguable, but I'd say he is. Sacrifice, heroic trait. Steve never views himself as superior. He's always willing to sacrifice his own life for the safety to help others. Worldly attainment. This doesn't... I did not highlight that as red. I should have highlighted that as red. It doesn't fit. It does... This matches the trait. I mean, because he sacrifices all the time. I think this has a lot to do with the setting and the setup for the character. Steve wants to be a soldier. It's very convenient to portray him as having nothing more valuable to do instead. Just like from a writing standpoint, you don't have to spend time dealing with that. By making his world focused on only what he's giving up, though, the character, he actually has very little. One can imagine that any good fortune that would come to him, he'd just immediately share with others. So suffering, yes. Not for any obvious attainment, but a lot of suffering, part of his sacrifice. More directly, he does want strong, but he's willing and desires to sacrifice himself as a soldier, not because he wants to die, but because he sees that as the most value his life could have. And constantly trying to make that sacrifice, he is not only failing in that to make it, but he alienates his only friend. I say that, at least a little. I mean, there's the one scene, he doesn't spend time with him, but that's what we see. So again, Steve's suffering seems to result from his unhealthy or unrefined relationship with sacrifice. He's imbalanced in his willingness to give. Heroic power. He's a super soldier from an experimental treatment. How does he get it? Well, he's willing to sacrifice for the experiment. During the experiment, he could quit. It's unclear if the process would have failed. Maybe he would have ended up with less strength. We don't really know, but he continues to sacrifice and suffer and is rewarded with the power. Hooray. Beta rays. It's not really explained. And who knows? I mean, maybe it's that Red Skull was unwilling to sacrifice as much, or at least risk his life in the process of when he was applying the formula, and that's why he's not as strong because of it. It's all speculation. I don't know. Refinement. Very little of this is actually encountered in the film, but he's also like, he's the best a man can be, a human can be, so he was chosen because he would be the one who would wield it properly, and Erskine's right about that. He's not trying to become a superior man like Red Skull. He's not trying to do it to benefit someone else. He's doing it to benefit himself. He's doing it to benefit other people. His delay from being a soldier once he becomes Captain America super strong, it's his choice to seize an opportunity. That's effectively a refinement, right? Where he's got the power, and then what? They tell him to use it to sell bail bonds, so he army bonds. Sorry, they sell army bonds, and so he sells army bonds. That's what he does until he doesn't really seize that. Yeah, now he has the agency. He needs to apply this power properly now that he has it. But yeah, in many ways, that's part of the power. Super Soldier Steve adapts to his new limits. He knows how to use his abilities properly pretty much from the get-go, or at least, however much training takes place. But in many ways, that's just part of it. So, rival. Zola is the lesser villain of this movie, but Red Skull is pretty much directly Steve's rival. He covets super soldier power and took it by force. He has superhuman physical attributes from that procedure, though it's unclear how these compare to Steve, but he obtained it to increase his own power. And he demonstrates he's unwilling to make a personal sacrifice. I mean, in this way, he contrasts with Steve, who wants the power without a sacrifice. So I'm going to count that as a penalty there, that because you can't have both. I'm just to make it more fitting. I mean, as the mastermind, Red Skull is obviously the mastermind and the masterminding the greater evil of this plot. In terms of worldly attainment, he's very powerful within the German military. Red Skull he has access to resources, troops, has built an organization, has persuaded many to follow him to his cause, and again, corrupted trait. Again, sacrifice. This gets a little muddy. While Red Skull is unwilling to sacrifice anything personal, he does have a moral code. I mean, this is partly speculation, although I think that it's well justified within the movie. It's not super clear. Red Skull is unwilling to sacrifice anything personal, but he believes the world is going to remain in chaos and suffering itself without strong guardians, and that only these guardians will be able to do what is necessary without the dissent of the lesser people. Hence, it's the morally good thing to do to fix the world. Sacrifice the thousands, get rid of those would-be dissenters, and unify the world under its true order. How much of that thought process for Red Skull, how much of that is ego or delusion, it's speculative, but like Zola says, I mean, he concludes that the best thing to do for the world is to bomb most of the world capitals, and he's close to being able to achieve it. Despite, there's criticisms of that plan, like there's a power vacuum, how do you know it'll end up on top, etc. But sorry, I think the handling of Red Skull is actually one of the weakest points of the first Avenger, and the movie pretty clearly shifts the role of Red Skull within the formula from being more like a rival to then being more like the mastermind. This shift happens when Steve physically confronts Red Skull, and he, at his base, and he reveals Red Skull is also enhanced, and that he won't just brawl with Captain America, and then Red Skull literally reveals his true face. He more fulfills the mastermind role from that point on in the film. Red Skull always is the mastermind with the plan, behind Hydra existing, but in many ways, until Steve confronts him, Steve is unaware of Hydrascope. Once he leads missions and fight Hydra, then Hydra become more active. I mean, it works by convenience for the narrative, and yeah. You can also analyze the villains in terms of, and Steve itself in terms of just sort of this idea that leadership, in this way, Zola is, he's a leader without any of the positive qualities of a leader, while Red Skull is a leader, but he's a tyrant. He just sort of believes might makes right. But I don't think this is as good. I think that, sacrifice is more fitting. And by centering around sacrifice, this makes the first Avenger a version of Cain Abel, the Cain Abel story, where Steve is Abel, ascending from a poor, weak kid to a super soldier war hero while still caring nothing for his own personal attainment, and all of that achieved through work and honesty and sacrifice. While Red Skull is Cain, soured by the idea that anything can be accomplished by prudent sacrifice, willing to destroy the world, forcing it to conform to his version of reality. The first Avenger is actually one of my least favorite among the MCU films, but it's quite fun to symbolically analyze. I think the first act is amazingly well structured, while the later parts of the film kind of relax into a comfortable good versus evil action story. Red Skull is really not fully explored. I think it's a massive missed opportunity. The scenes alternate between Steve and Red Skull for a lot of the beginning of the movie, but pretty much all of Red Skull's scenes are exposition and setup. They don't give him very much characterization, certainly not much explanation of why his beliefs, his viewpoint, despite his personality and motivations being a perfect opposite of Steve Rogers. I mean, I think exploring Red Skull's misanthropy and contrasting it with Steve's optimism and his love for humanity would have really strengthened the film. So Steve exemplifies heroic sacrifice, and it's not a coincidence that at the end of the film, he sacrifices himself. It's what he does. We'll see that again later in films with Captain America. So, Thor 1. Like the first Avenger, Thor is a bit more challenging to analyze in this framework, but very interesting. At least I think it is. Both Thor and Captain America are more clearly representative of like every heroism, every trait, especially than say the rampaging Hulk or CEO by day Iron Man. Um, their challenges are much more diverse, and because of that, they have to represent and display different aspects of heroism. Like Steve Rogers, I analyzed Thor mostly like in the movie and trying to figure out individually what he seemed to represent best among the Avengers, and there was definitely a centrality to Thor and his conflicts in Thor 1. I've settled on duty. Duty for several reasons. Thor, duty. He's a prince, soon to be king, even considered almost ready by the existing king. He's vain, but Thor always feels a sense of duty to his people and their safety, even if he fails them in his actions. We never see a Thor that lacks the sense of duty. In his failures at the start of the film, they reflect his incomplete or underdeveloped sense of duty, that he can't get all the priorities straight of how he's supposed to act, although on some level he's always doing it because he thinks that's what the right thing is for the people. Worldly attainment, this is a bit reversed. It kind of emphasizes what are the problems with a two-class society having nobility or class striation. But I mean, Thor is basically born into his power and attainment. Hypothetically, he could say he could lose it, lose the respect of the people by being undutiful. So I interpret this more as the maintenance rather than attainment, but maintenance of what's been gifted to him, sort of representing responsibility or duty within his station, and people seem to like him well enough. I mean, if we take the coronation scene, they like Thor, right? But we do see that Thor has an unhealthy relationship with his status, mostly due to conflicts about his own limitations. He wants to protect the people, but when he has suggestions about how to do that, they're overruled by the king. Well, he also respects the king, so he can't figure out what are the priority of his duties. How does that work? And what's most important? Is it to his family? Is it to the king? Is it to himself and his own intuition? Is it to the realm? And his choice of defiance, I mean, we can't really say. Is it truly because he thinks that's the best? Is it his vanity or his arrogance getting the better of him? Is it Loki whispering in his ear? We don't really know. But Thor is suffering because he hasn't figured it all out. He hasn't figured out, compared to a lot of the other heroes, and especially compared to the other heroes as we've seen up until this point in the MCU, he's got everything going for him. He's not running from people like Hulk, and he's not having to build up his powers. He just has them like Iron Man. But he's still suffering in some way. Heroic power, the power of Thor, as it's called in this movie. Later films elaborate on it and suggest that there's several layers: the protective armor, the legendary weapon, his own physiology, godhood, whatever that means. But unlike a lot of the other movies, the first section of this film ends with him being stripped of his power, and then he needs to reclaim it. He demonstrates a failure to properly follow his duties, as judged by Odin, and therefore demonstrates he cannot be trusted with his powers, so Odin takes them from him. That's at least how it appears. I'm not going to bother detailing the difference between Mjolnir as a conduit versus a source of power, as it's sort of made more unclear in Thor 3. But for the purposes of this story, its access to his power is inhibited by Odin. And however the magic works out, or whatever solutions exist, it's all there. Manifestation, I'm going to count it as not working. While you can argue that it's his willingness to sacrifice his life for others that activates Odin's command, where he gets his powers back, I really would focus on his speech to Loki. I don't think he's fighting the Destroyer to the death as a demonstration of willingness to sacrifice. That's like what Steve Rogers would do. He does it as barter. As bartering. He tries to barter with Loki and say, hey, whatever it takes to, he trade my own life, sure, whatever. He just wants to make a trade with Loki for the safety of others. It's not fighting. It's an elevation of his duty to protect the people above himself, not his own glory or his own triumph, just whatever it takes to keep innocent people safe from Loki. Refinement, though, does fit. Like the manifestation, this movie overlaps these concepts, and you'll see that in Black Panther and Spider-Man: Homecoming to a certain extent as well. The movies where they start with a lot of the power, because they begin with the heroic power. It's that they're wielding it improperly and that they have it taken from them or restricted. He gains it back by demonstrating a refinement of his understanding of the purpose of that power, to use it in line with the duties. Um, yeah, but the core concept still applies. What the connection between the heroic trait and the heroic power allows it to manifest. There's an explicit test or trial to reclaim the heroic power. Sort of, I mean, these movies break from the formula in that way, so it's not complete in all places. Anyway, back to Thor 1. The villains. The rival, we have two villains again, Loki and Laufey. And like the first Avenger, they're a bit mixed. Loki seems both like he's Thor's rival and the mastermind. I'm going to argue that Laufey still very strongly fits the mold of the rival, even though the resolution is very different than some of the other stories. While the past imperialism of Jotunheim has forced the Jotuns to fall under Asgardian protection, Laufey still desires a restoration of the Frost Giant casket, which would allow them to continue that conquest. In this way, Laufey covets power and even has some, and seems to have very little duty to his own people. This is a little unclear, but he, when the Asgardians just show up, he's very content just to throw his guards at him, even if it's he seems more interested in the insult than the lives of his people. And despite their destitution, Laufey seems really content on continued war. The film doesn't really explore Laufey's motivations, so this is vague. But I think that I think he represents a kingly figure who is failing to represent a duty to his people, at least not over his own goals. You can argue that this might generally be in the nature of the Frost Giants, so maybe his people all agree with him, we don't know. But his duty to the people is ambiguous, and rather than fighting Thor, Loki tricks Laufey and steals that victory from Thor, allows him to be the killer of the enemy king. But in that sense, Laufey has kingly power and superhuman abilities, but lacks a duty to his people. It's, as I say, is demonstrated by his eagerness for war, despite their apparent domestic problems. By that I mean, it doesn't look like it's a thriving place. Whether that's what it would look like, that's what it looks like, thriving or not thriving. That's where the confusion layers in, but it looks pretty decimated. But he wants to keep war. Anyway, something much smoother. Mastermind Loki still fits the mastermind pattern very well, and at the same time, as a lot of people say, he's much more fully developed than some of the other masterminds across these movies. Worldly attainment, Loki is a prince, and apparently a respected royal warrior, and apparently a respected advisor. I mean, he's mastered advanced magics. Despite his own desire to rule, Odin's grooming and Thor's friendship really suggests that Loki was going to be a valuable advisor to the king. That's what it does. But, corrupted trait. In contrast to Thor, Loki has a twisted sense of duty with regards to the people that he desires to rule. Rather than protect Jotunheim and make peace, Loki just strives to enact Thor's original misguided goal of wiping them all out, and he learns how to bring this about. The idea is expanded on in the Avengers and matches really closely with Red Skull in the first Avenger, that he views his duty as that of a superior being protecting lesser beings, the ones he rules over. Thus, he very much buys into might makes right. Anything he's strong enough to conquer, he's justifiable and the right to do so and the rightful ruler of. While Thor learns that he can't simply force his own perspective and say this is the correct one, even if he's the ruler. Loki just buys into that completely, and he just, throughout the movie, all he's doing is seeking the power necessary to outcompete Thor in what he views as a competition. He just thinks they need to demonstrate. Loki believes he understands what leadership is and rulership is and what duty to their people means, and therefore he just has to show how strong he is and that he's stronger than everybody else. Then Odin's gonna like him. He's strong. Thor's tough. If Loki already knows that people know he's smarter than Thor, so if he shows he's stronger than Thor too, that's all there is. And really, there's nothing more than that. Doesn't matter if a bunch of people die in the process. He's the king. So again, I base a lot of this on the direct dialogue in their final fight. I mean, they effectively debate whether Loki's plan is a valid one and what's the priority of their duties. I mean, they're Jotunheim's basically a protectorate of Asgard. I mean, what's their duty to them if they want to sacrifice him for some other gain? What does it really matter? But that, you know, Loki basically comes down saying, hey, he can do whatever he wants as long as he's capable of it, even if he sacrifices all these people. Thor says, no, we're supposed to protect them, so that's our duty to them. We can't just throw that out the window. I think many of the sequels movies follow another formula, and that formula deviates a lot from the origin story formula. Like directly, I mean, it has some institution or organization that becomes corrupted and has to be torn down. Both the heroes and the villains tend to connect to that institution in some way, and the villains oftentimes are sort of representative of that idea rather than, you know, direct contrast to the heroes compared to how they are in the origin stories. But the sequel films for at least, you know, Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, they follow these same symbolic core. They just follow it further down the road. Iron Man continues to solve problems with creativity and learn more about how to apply that to benefit others and to be a hero. Captain America continues to demonstrate, you know, what needs to be sacrificed, what's the right role of being willing to sacrifice, how can that shape the best possible world, the best possible future. Thor continues to learn about what does it mean to have duty, you know, be a ruler, have duty to his people, and contrasts himself a lot with the decisions of his father. And for the villains, I mentioned earlier that the Avengers have a more classical villains in that they don't serve as pure foils to the heroes, but have strong symbolic value independently. Captain America, the first Avenger, and Thor 1 perfectly set up Loki for the villain as the villain of the Avengers. He represents tyranny. While both Red Skull and Loki in Thor 1 are tyrannical, they represent aspects of tyranny. The willingness to sacrifice others for that tyrant's gain or vision. The corrupted sense of duty to rule over inferior people that the tyrant implicitly believes might makes right. Loki embodies this clearly in the Avengers. He's carrying that logic from Thor 1 forward and becomes really, you know, the second tyrant to try and conquer Earth with the Tesseract. That's why Captain America is the first Avenger, right? But yeah, I mean, the Marvel movies, they're just pure popcorn entertainment. There's nothing deeper going on at all in any of this. Thor 1's actually one of my favorite MCU films. I still agree with a lot of the criticisms, despite that it's still one of my favorites. I mean, most of the second act is messy. The characters are just, they're not great. They're not clear either. I think Thor 1 has clear symbolic mythological sense to it, not just because it has guardians and gods and all this stuff, but it very much feels like a, you know, mythical hero comes to Earth for a day type story. I mean, aside from fitting the symbolic pattern I outlined, Thor 1 clearly connects its central conflicts to familial conflicts between a father and rival siblings. As a moviegoer and fan of Marvel Comics, I was just blown away when I first saw it. This was the first MCU film I went into thinking, well, I like the MCU. I'm going to give it a chance. My expectations are not high. Instead, I thought the Asgardians were handled masterfully in a way that made them serious, or at least not a joke, and at the same time not just insane or bizarre beyond any reasonable handling of them. And compared to the preceding films, I got a superhero story grounded in personal relationships. I mean, Iron Man and Hulk are a bit detached, though, I mean, I understand why, but, you know, it's not quite as personal. Phase 1 complete, and I'm almost halfway through. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to leave Guardians of the Galaxy for the end. It deviates from the pattern in several weird ways, so for simplicity, I'm just going to keep the streak going. But I do need to take a bit of a break. I've been talking continuously for a while now, so I'm going to pause this, and I'm just going to continue it in part 2. So thank you very much, and part 2, I'll make that shortly.